All right, good morning, guys. So we are going to get started with the portrait. And so typically the way I start is I ask you all who the people are on the screen. And so I would wait to hear what you all would have to say. But on the left, we have Audrey Hepburn, and on the right, we have Barack Obama. And so usually I'll say, how do we know who these people are? Has anyone in the room ever met either of these people? And so occasionally someone has met Barack Obama, which is pretty cool. But Audrey Hepburn is no longer living, but she's sort of this iconic um, person that was an actress here in the United States, and was really famous for all of the work that she made and all of the movies she was in. And so you all might recognize her from Breakfast at Tiffany's. But these would be questions that I would ask you. So you all use social media all the time. So you're constantly looking at photographs of people. You're always seeing portraits. And so looking at these two, if no one in the room has met these people, how do we know who these people are? How can I claim that that's Audrey Hepburn? How can I claim that that's Barack Obama? So you all would, be able to tell from the news. You'd see them in magazines. So portraits can be really telling. And the way that you set up a portrait can make a difference in how the viewer understands the sitter. So these two people are the sitters in the images. And so in a lot of portraits, you would see sort of with Barack Obama, more of like he would kind of dress himself or present himself more in the style of John F. Kennedy. And so it was more of like a get to work attitude. So you might not see him with a blazer on, and his sleeves might be rolled up, and he might just have a tie on, or he might not have a tie on. And so those things can help the viewer make connections about the sitter. So with Audrey Hepburn, when I was y'all's age, when I was in high school, Gap did a campaign that just had these huge photographs of Audrey Hepburn hanging in the store windows. And it was from when she was in the movie Funny Face, and she wore a black turtleneck and black slacks, like little capri pants, and ballet flats. And that was sort of the look at the time. Everyone wanted to kind of mimic that look. But Gap was able to take a long dead sitter, someone who had been gone for a while, and take that portrait and turn it into something that people found to be iconic and something that they wanted to imitate years after she was no longer living and years after she had been a young woman. So these are things to think about when you're looking at portraits. Okay, so when you all are taking notes, I want you to write down the artist's name. So we've got Philippe Halsman in the bottom left, and then we have Alex Soth, and Soth is spelled Soth. It sounds like both. It's not Soth. So lots of people are interested in faces. You all take selfies all the time. I can see you all on Snapchat, sharing photographs of literally just your face. And we're constantly seeing these images in all sorts of places. So in the bottom left, I usually ask the class, who is that a photograph of? Does anyone recognize that person? Maybe you all have studied him in your Spanish classes or in your art classes, but it's Salvador Dali. And the artwork that he would make is more in tune with surrealism. So if you're familiar with the melting clocks, that was a painting that he made. And so what I'm actually going to do is pull that up so that you all can see that. So you all are probably familiar with this piece and have studied it at some point. But he had lots of these photographs taken by Philippe Halsman. And sort of in keeping with the style of the work that he was creating, this sort of otherworldly work, when he set up to do his portrait. Let me flip back. When he set up to do his portrait, I think it was fitting for them to take the mustache and to kind of pull it up and use some wax with it. Philippe Halsman has a really close crop. So that's something for you to pay attention to when you're taking your portraits. I want you to be thinking about the background. The background is equally as important as the foreground. And when you're taking your pictures, be thoughtful, like pay attention to the faces that you're seeing in these. You don't want your photographs necessarily to look like you're at a football game smiling with all of your friends. We're trying to look for some fine art photography in the work that you're creating. So a little bit more thoughtful and thinking about the sitter and how to best highlight the features of the sitter. So on the right, we have the photograph by Alex Soth. Alex Soth is one of the most famous contemporary photographers in the world right now. And you've got this woman who, when we sit in class and talk about it, usually a lot of people think that she's a swimmer because she has her swim cap on. But it could be some sort of like hair and makeup situation. Maybe she's got the cap on to put a wig on. But she's not looking directly at the camera. And that could be something that you could utilize in the photographs that you're doing too. Alex Soth has lots of portraits. I'd say he's more famous for the full body portraits that he takes, and we'll see some of those a little bit later in the slideshow. Okay, so the National Portrait Gallery is in London, and it is an entire museum that is dedicated specifically to portraits. So you can walk through and find all sorts of paintings, you can find sculptures, you can find more contemporary work like photography being displayed there as well. Okay, what is a portrait? So these are questions that I actually do want you to write down in your notebook. So go ahead and make sure that you have all of these written down. And this would probably be a good time to just pause this video so that you can get these things written down. So you want to attempt to express the character of a person, offer insight into a person beyond the details of appearance. So how can you, sort of manipulate the situation to get the photo that you want? Reveal an unknown side of his or her character. So I've talked to you all before about performances and performance art. How can you photograph someone when they really are who they are when they're alone? So how can you show a fresh perspective on someone that we already know? If you're thinking about somebody, like your parents, maybe, I always use my mom as my example. My mom will want a photograph where her makeup's done and her hair looks good and all of those things, but you have to sort of manipulate the position because that's how the world knows her, but I know her very differently. I know her as my mom at home. And so I can try to work with her to make a better photo that feels more honest to me. So it can capture the person, location, outfit, and it can represent a time in history. So as we move forward in photography, we'll talk about how you capture time in history. It can be clothing. Clothing can date an image. The way that someone's hair is done can date an image. The place where someone is, if someone's sitting like in a car, the car can put a timestamp on something, or if someone's holding a cell phone, that phone is really telling, or if there's a TV in the background, all of those can help date a photograph. Lots of sitters have a self-awareness of the camera, and that can be really tricky. So, if you want them to have a self-awareness, like say it's your senior portrait, they know they're getting their portrait taken. But lots of people have a habitual pose. So if you were to go to a football game and take pictures with your friends, there's a good chance someone would say, okay, I'm going to take your photo. And usually I ask the class, what would you all do? And a lot of times you all take your arms and you put your arms around each other. This is something that's great for a photograph at a football game, but I want you to think about how to break away from this, and how to get something that looks a little bit more natural. So the photographer must get into the soul of the person. So you need to work with that person, work with the sitter, get to know them, feel comfortable with them to get to express who they are through your work. Okay, there's the photographer, the sitter, and the viewer. So these are the three people you have to think about. So the first one is the photographer and the sitter. So it can be a really beautiful experience between the two of you. On the opposite end, it can also be a battle for what the other person wants. So if you walk into it and you understand what you're looking for, I have found sometimes it helps to even have poses to show the person that you are taking photographs of, to help kind of guide them a little bit, because they may be lost in what it is that you're looking for. They don't understand, or they think they look better a certain way. So if you can be more prepared and planned out beforehand, that's going to help with the success of the photo shoot. Whereas it can be a battle, and I find that it can be a battle usually, especially with teenagers, when you take all of these photos of your friend, and then you show the photos to your friend and you love them, but your friend sees them and they're like, oh my gosh, these are awful, and no, you can't use any of these. Don't show them the photos. You don't need to show them the photos. You get to choose what you want to put on display. So know that, so long as it's appropriate and the clothing is appropriate. But just know that you have that choice. And I have found more people regret going ahead and sharing the photos before printing them for excuse me, before printing them for class. It would be better for you to just pick and choose, or it can be a collaboration. So my friend had been in a really bad accident when I was kind of in the middle of college, in a rock climbing accident, and there was a chance that she wasn't going to make it, but she did, and she had surgery and was much better. And I went to visit her, and during that time we did a photo shoot. So I photographed her, and the purpose of the photo shoot was to document jewelry that I had made, and use her as a model. But I ended up loving the photography so much better than showing it as a model for the jewelry. That I used the prints, and I painted one of the portraits of her, and it was this really beautiful and sort of intimate time in our friendship. Okay, the viewer. So the viewer becomes intimately involved in a portrait. The viewer has the opportunity to walk up and see the work, and they can stare at it for hours. Whereas if there were a portrait of me on, if you were to come up to me, you might not stand in front of me for 5 minutes and just stare, but you have the option to do that when you're looking at a portrait. Any knowledge that you have of the sitter will cloud the way that you interpret the sitter in the photograph. So those are things to know. In the bottom right, we have a photograph that actually is Annie Leibovitz. So if you all have looked through Vogue magazine, you've seen work made by her before, or Harper's Bazaar. She works with, if I think you could name any famous person, she's probably photographed them. And she actually came to U of H and did a speech, I don't know, maybe like in 2019. And I went and I got her book, and on the cover of the book is this photograph, and I've always used this photograph for this slide. But you can see sort of her whole setup. But the neat thing is this photo was taken in Houston, so I didn't know that until I bought the book. But you can see she's got sort of the diffuser above that she's actually built, and you could use an overcast day is going to give you the best light so that you don't have really intense shadows. But you can see how intense the setup can be just to take a photograph outdoors. All right, the painted portrait versus the photographic portrait. So the photographer has an ability to choose a wide range of subjects, and that sort of gives you insight into the character, vitality, and intimacy. Whereas with a painting, someone is going to need to sit still for you for a very long amount of time. You can take a photograph in a fraction of a second. You can capture all sorts of photographs in an hour. But if you're taking a photograph or if you're doing a painting of someone, they may have to sit quietly for you, for a month, in order for you to work on the painting. So we've got these two pieces here. So on the left, we have Queen Elizabeth, and on the right, we have a photograph by Joseph Kudelka. Joseph Kudelka is a Magnum photographer, so we sort of talked about that in our last lesson. I think we did. A Magnum photographer is an artist collective called Magnum, and you can go to the Magnum website and see the list of artists today that are Magnum photographers. But basically what happened is in the 50s, if you were working for Life magazine, I'll use Life as an example, at the end of the magazine, they would have an article that would be like, children living in different parts of the world. So like, I'm imagining my parents getting the Life magazine, they'd flip to the back, they'd be excited to read this article every week or every month that the magazine came out. And the magazine didn't have, it would be like following a child, a day in the life of a child, let's say like in Egypt. And so a photographer would be put on assignment. The photographer would go and would actually take the photographs. They would bring the photographs back to the magazine, and the photographer would be living with that family and kind of learning about that family and photographing them and documenting them. And then he would send the photographs back to Life. Life would own the photographs, and the photographs, the captions underneath, really painted a bright and cheery story when it wasn't always a bright and cheery story. And so, I'll use the example of there's a little boy and he's carrying, buckets of water, and they're saying like, oh, what a beautiful scenery that this child is carrying these buckets of water, but he's had to carry buckets of water that weigh 100 pounds, and he's had to carry them over 5 miles a day, and that's taken up like a quarter of his day or a half of his day, and he has to do it every day. But all of the story was light and fluffy, and the photographers started to get a bit frustrated with that, especially because they didn't have the rights, and sometimes the captions underneath the photos were just a lie. It wasn't true at all. And so a group of photographers came together and decided that they wanted to create this artist collective that would give them the rights to their photographs. They could choose the photographs, and they would be able to write the captions for the photographs as well. And so that's how, the Magnum Collective got started. So on the left-hand side, we've got Queen Elizabeth. On the right-hand side, we have this little girl. Joseph Kudelka took lots of photographs in Russia. And so, we'll talk about the Queen, and we'll talk about the way that she's sitting for her portrait and the color of her dress and all of the jewelry that she has on. And she's definitely trying to look her best for this portrait. And on the right, we'll look at this piece by Joseph Kudelka. And we have a little girl dressed in white. So I usually ask the class, how old do you all think she is? And we typically get anywhere from like 12 years old to 19 years old. But she is in all white. The photograph is black and white. And when we're looking at her surroundings, everything looks a little bit dilapidated. And so you've got her with her flowers. Evidently, she's excited about something. There's a celebration that day. And then behind her, you have the two women that are in the window. So if you hadn't seen that, you've got those two women. And so we'll talk about why do you come to the window when are situations when you run to your window. And it's usually to see something outside, when something's different or something's exciting or something's happening. And so we have these two sort of portraits of these women juxtaposed against each other. one where the queen would have to sit for a long time, one that happened in the blink of an eye, but special, to be presumed special moments in both of these women's lives. Okay, questioning the photographic portrait. So this would probably be a good time to pause so that you all can get these written down in your notebook. So does it reflect a unique meeting of the photographer and the sitter? So if you all are just running around the cafeteria or taking portraits of each other in my classroom, I don't consider that to be very unique. So you need to be thinking about how to set up the photo, how to get the photograph taken. Could anyone have taken the photo? So there needs to be some thought in the way that you're presenting it when it's finished. Who's in charge? That's a big one. Make sure that you, the photographer, are in charge and not your friend or not your parent when you're taking these pictures. Does the picture give insight beyond appearance? So, you know, when you're taking a portrait of someone, if you are, and this sort of fits with the original view, let's say that someone has really beautiful curly hair and you want to photograph them with their curly hair, but you don't tell them that, and they go and they straighten their hair on the day of the portrait. That's going to be problematic because it's not what you wanted. And so as much information as you can give the sitter beforehand is going to help the situation and help sort of get the photograph that you're looking for in the end. And you want to give them as much information because they're a little nervous too. So is the sitter confident in their own skin? I would not have someone sit down for you and only take 3 portraits, especially when you all are working digitally and this is also new to you. You have the ability to take hundreds of pictures. So why not sit with them for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, take all kinds of photos with all different backgrounds, and that's going to give you a lot more to work with. Okay. So is it possible to not pose? Something you have to ask yourself. Are we captivated, touched, or moved by, that should say, photograph of someone? How will it be judged by a future audience? And does a long dead sitter speak to you across the years in their portrait? So when we look back at Audrey Hepburn, she was so iconic to me. I think I even had a purse that had Audrey Hepburn on it, like when I was little in the 90s. You know, for some reason, she really spoke to me. And I still remember that Gap campaign that was probably in like, I don't know, 2007, 2008. And that was something that was able to speak to me. All right, taking a portrait. You have to tell the sitter where and how to stand or sit. Don't just say like, okay, stand there, let me take your picture. If they need to bring their chin down, direct them. If they have a black hair rubber band on their wrist, tell them to take it off and take it off beforehand so they don't have the outline of the rubber band on their wrist. If they have too many necklaces on, tell them to take that off. All of these things are going to help. You are the photographer. They can't see themselves when they're taking these pictures, so you have to direct them. If they have hair in their face, move it out of their face. Always ask first. But do the things that you can do to help make the photograph better. So make sure you have to be confident in that as well. So I find that when I'm taking photographs of people, it helps to be like, oh yeah, that looks great. You're doing a great job. Can you take a step back for me? Can you take a step forward? Can you move your chin down? Can you put your hair behind your ear? Move your hair a little bit more behind your shoulder? Whatever, but you need to be the one directing the show. And you need to tell them how to look or react and what expression to have. A lot of times they can just go to that, oh, it's like getting my school photo taken. They'll have a big smile on their face. But that might not be what you want. So if you need them to look off camera, tell them to look beyond the lens. Tell them to look over your shoulder. These are things that you have the opportunity to do. Things to think about. You have to think about your lighting. You need to think about your location. Think about who your sitter is and the clothing that they're wearing. So lighting, I would say go to a window in your house where the lighting is subtle and coming in. Use a tripod. Have the person sit next to you. You can pull a chair up to the window and then photograph them that way. The light should not be intense and bright. It should just be sort of subtle light. The location, think about your background. It, you know, you don't want it to be too busy. So think about what you can use. And if you're looking through the viewfinder and you see that it's busy in the background, move them or move the items out of the background. That can help too. With the sitter, you all are going to be taking 10 portraits of 10 different people. And so you need to think through where you're taking your photos, but who you're going to take your photos of. I think it's better to not only take photographs of people that are your age. If you can get some photos of your parents or your grandparents, those can always be exciting and really successful. And honestly, they may mean more to you when you are older than the photo of some random person in your science class. So think about your sitter, and you need to schedule with your sitter what time you want to do. And when they're available. So that's going to be tricky for you because you're not relying on certain things anymore. You're relying on the sitter and the schedule of the sitter. And then you have to think about the clothing too. So a t-shirt that says Kincaid across it in big print is going to be distracting. So you need to tell the sitter to wear something simple or plain. Those things will help. Okay, in your photographs, I'm going to let you all do 1 or 2 details photos. So details photos don't necessarily have to be photographs of someone's face. So Annie Leibovitz, we talked about her earlier. She was the photographer that I had seen speak at U of H. She has a body of work called Pilgrimage, where she went and photographed sort of the ephemera left behind from different famous people. So those are the chalk pastels that were Georgia O'Keeffe's. And then on the right, we have photographs by Bill Brandt. So someone's knees, the hand kind of on the back of the head. But good examples would be details. So hands of a sculptor or an artist, the feet of a ballet dancer, the fists of boxers. All of these things can be considered a sort of an intimate portrait without including the face. All right, the plain background portrait. So the person is isolated from his or her natural environment. So we have this beautiful body of work by Richard Avedon called In the American West. And so usually we'll talk about, what are the jobs that each of these people does, or what is the work that they do. And so by removing them from their environment, we have to start asking questions. And for Richard Avedon, these portraits were sort of straight on. These were taken with a 4x5. You can tell by the way that the film has sort of these negative spaces here. And you can see by the clips. So I think that's a little side bit that you might not know looking at these now. But you all get to use the 4x5 when you're in advanced photography. So we've got these 3 pictures here. And it's that sort of straight on, almost deadpan. There's not much emotion in their face. And we'll do a deadpan lesson in photo 2. But each one is pretty interesting when you're looking at it. All right, the plain background portrait. So we've got a photograph by Irving Penn on the left of Truman Capote. And on the right, we've got another photograph by an artist named Reineke Dijkstra. And so the one on the left, the photographer is Irving Penn. The portrait is of Truman Capote. So if you all, circling back to Audrey Hepburn, she was in Breakfast at Tiffany's. That was a short story written by Truman Capote. He also wrote In Cold Blood, which is a great book if you haven't read it before. And then if you've watched To Kill a Mockingbird or read To Kill a Mockingbird, there's a little boy named Dill, and Dill comes to visit in the summer. Dill is based on Truman Capote as a child. So the author of To Kill a Mockingbird was friends with Truman Capote when they were very little. So Dill's personality is evidently mimicked after Truman Capote, which is pretty neat. But you sort of have this really thoughtful photograph. The crop is close. We don't have negative space all the way around him. And I think this could be in a moment where he wasn't necessarily paying attention to the camera. So when you're taking your photos, what I like to do is I will tell my sitter to sit for me. And I'll tell them that I'm like working on the light, which I could be. And then I will take their photograph. But sometimes I'll take a second one right after I've taken the first one because they're aware that I'm taking the first one. But when I take the second one, they seem to loosen up a little bit because they think their job is done. And in those moments, that's where you can get the most beautiful pictures where it doesn't feel posed. On the right, we have the picture by Reineke Dextra. She photographs people specifically in this body of work. It's preteens, sort of in their awkward years, which I'm sure you all can recall, at the beach. And so when she photographs, she uses a light. So the body of the sitter, for her, they're typically standing, but the body is sort of illuminated on the beach. And they're just really these awkward poses of these kids. So it's these preteen years where you're still sort of an adolescent and kind of running around and having fun. You're not quite an adult yet. But you will see in her photos, like occasionally it's one person, sometimes it's three people together. But they're very quick and they look awkward. And there's sort of that deadpan, there's negative space all the way around. The background is very simple. The face is dead on. And they're not necessarily smiling at the camera. All right, portraits of the unseen photographer. So sometimes if you can take a photograph without someone knowing that you're taking the photo, that can be more successful. So we've got the photograph by Walker Evans in the bottom left. And so my understanding is that Walker Evans would keep a shutter release cable down his sleeve and had the lens kind of peeking out of his jacket so that people didn't know that they were getting their photograph taken. He didn't want people to know, and then he would just take the pictures of people he saw on the bus. Philip Lorca de Corsia is on the right, or his photograph is, and so he will photograph people without them knowing. So that could mean that he's got a camera attached somewhere up high, like in Times Square, and there's so many lights and so many different things going on that you would never know your photo had been taken. And then he can remotely release the shutter, and that will photograph the person as they're walking and sort of illuminate the sitter. There'll be a flash that goes off. Not a sitter because they're walking, but you'll see it when you do your Pinterest 100. So this photograph we talk about, is it a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed? So it's slow. You can see the subway that's moving in the background, the lights. She has sort of this awkward stance. And more recently, I've learned that this is a curator, like a photography curator in New York. All right, we are almost done. So group portraits. I'm going to let you all do one group portrait for your project if you'd like to. So this is a beautiful body of work made by Nicholas Nixon. I saw it at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston, maybe 5 years ago. He prints them. He takes them with an 8x10 camera. So that's like a 4x5 with the bellows. But the photograph, instead of being 4 inches by 5 inches, is 8x10. And so he started photographing his wife and her sisters back in the 60s or 70s. And every single year he takes a photograph of them all together. So when you look at the body of work, it's really beautiful. You see these women age, you see different ways that they sort of hold on to each other. There have been years where someone's been sick and you see their interaction with that woman, or someone that's been pregnant, you see their interaction with her during that year. So your challenge is that it can be difficult to have a lot of people in one photo and try to create a strong composition without having everyone just stick their arms around each other. All right, on the left, we've got a photograph by Torbjorn Rodland. And we usually talk about how do you think he did this? So typically what we think is he's used a window and he's cut some sort of cellophane and colors and has it sort of projected onto her face, or you could use a projector and project some sort of imagery onto someone in order to photograph them. On the right, we have a picture by Roe Etheridge. You all studied Roe Etheridge in still life. So Roe Etheridge has like high fashion photography. He does commercial work, but he also does fine art photography. And so when we look at this picture, usually we talk a little bit about like the Stepford wives, and we look at that turkey, and we've never seen such a shiny turkey. And everything seems very posed. The model seems very posed and kind of perfectly done up with stereotypical jewelry and sweater, and her hair is done a certain way. And she's kind of looking off from the camera. And in a way, it can be sort of poking fun of these traditions. On the left, we have a body of work by Carrie Mae Weems, and it's the Kitchen Table series. And so when you look at this on the Pinterest 100, you'll see this woman, you'll have this figure, and it's always taken sort of in a square format. And what happens is you see the passing of time through different posters that are on the wall in the background. You have different interactions of the woman in the back looking at herself in the mirror with other people. Here you have a sweet photograph of her, what can be presumed as her daughter, sitting with her, doing her makeup and sort of mimicking the things that her mom is doing. But you'll see her playing cards, you'll see her having her hair done. So all of these sort of intimate things that you do in your home, these are photographs that Carrie Mae Weems will capture in the same setting. On the right, we have a photograph by Dennis Stock. Dennis Stock would photograph people sort of like in their workplace. All right, so earlier we talked about how you can date a piece. This is a photograph by William Eggleston. So William Eggleston was one of the forefront runners in working with color film. For a long time, photography wasn't recognized as an art form, especially in color, but black and white was the type of film that was available. And so William Eggleston started shooting in color and takes hundreds of photographs, from my understanding, and just carries his camera with him everywhere he goes. But you sort of have this iconic portrait of this little boy in the backseat of a car. His collar, the car sort of date the image, so that tells us more. But this is one of his famous pieces. All right, Early Hudnall Jr. So he lives here in Houston. So we've got these two different photographs of children sort of playing in their community. And all of these photos on the right, you have all of these boys sort of stacked up together for a quick pose. So he would just sort of walk through his neighborhood and photograph people in the neighborhood. So I think it's neat. On the left, you can see the city of Houston in the background. But on the right, I think of, the boys that I can think of that would run around the neighborhood in the summer. And my mom always called them the boys of summer. And so just capturing that moment in time where they're a little silly, but they were happy and excited to be in a picture. It was something different for them. So I think that this is a great example of sort of a group portrait. Okay, Alex Soth. So we're back to Alex Soth. So he's got these two different photographs here. And now that I'm looking at them, they look, the person looks very similar, but on the left, Alex Oath, so he traveled along the Mississippi River. So when he was not yet famous, my understanding is that he would take a couple weeks off of work. He would take his big camera with him, either a 4x5 or an 8x10, and he would travel somewhere. So he chose to go to the Mississippi. He went along the river, and then he would go and he would talk to people that lived in different cities, and he would ask them, like, who are some interesting characters in your city, and then he would go find them and photograph them. So this guy on the left was really proud of his airplane collection that he had. He'd always wanted to be a pilot. So I think there's a bit of a sadness in it. He's obviously not super young. It doesn't necessarily look like it's something that's come to fruition, being a pilot. But this is one of the photographs he took, and it's sort of similar to Reineke Dextra, where you have all the negative space around the person. It's a full body portrait, but proud and excited to bring those planes out. So he created that whole body of work called Sleeping by the Mississippi. And he made a book. So you all will make a book when you all are seniors. And the company he uses called Blurb. So he made a book, and then he shipped the book to Houston, to the Museum of Fine Arts, to the photography curator named Ann Wilkes Tucker. And my understanding is she found the book in the mail that she received from him, and that was sort of how he got his start. Houston, the Museum of Fine Arts, is actually one of the leading museums to have one of the largest photography collections. So I think that's pretty cool. And I had talked about William Eggleston being a photographer and working in color. I would say that photography wasn't really considered a true art form that was respected maybe until like the early 90s. So people were working with photography, but it wasn't necessarily something that like your average collector would have in their collection. And then we have the photograph on the right. So the depth of field is really shallow. You've got lots of good blur. There's sort of blur around his hair. His eyes are closed, but he's on that rock, and the colors are sort of playing off of each other. So you've got those complementary colors of kind of the orangey red against the yellowy green. Okay, our last artist is Alessandra Sanguinetti. So Alessandra Sanguinetti lives in San Francisco. She's also a Magnum photographer, and I'll go back. Alex Soth is also a Magnum photographer as well. So when we look at these, it's really a beautiful body of work. She's gone back every so many years to photograph these two little girls that I believe are cousins. And you'll see sort of like greens and reds. She photographs using a square format. But it's fun to see the girls grow up together and see how their relationship evolves. And I believe she's got a fourth body of work coming out soon, if it hasn't already come out. But when you go to her website, the body of work is called like The Adventures of Guille and Belinda. And so these are the two girls. But paying attention to that red, paying attention to the subtlety of the light. Children are a really good subject when you're taking your photographs because they aren't so aware of the camera. And you can get some really beautiful, honest portraits from children that don't feel superposed. And sometimes they can be a bit more cooperative. Okay, so we've got 10 artists here. So these are the artists I want you to focus on for your Pinterest 100. So you should go to each of these artists' websites and pin 10 photographs from the website. I'm looking through the list, and I'm looking for the names of the Magnum photographers. So I think that Joseph Kudelka, probably Irving Penn and Richard Avedon were artists that started Magnum. And then Alex Soth and Alessandra Sanguinetti are all Magnum photographers. So when you go to the Magnum website, it's not going to let you pin directly from the website, but you should be able to find websites for each of these artists. So go ahead and work on that. When you're planning your portrait photographs, these would be questions that you need to ask yourself. So what I want you to do in your sketchbook is to write down these 11 questions and actually plan out each photo. I promise you, you will be so much happier that you did this because you'll be able to have a plan. And you need to get with the person that you want to photograph and find time to actually get those photographs taken. One other thing that I want to share with you all is with your camera, you all have a secondary lens. So let me pull that out. So you all have that 18 to 55 millimeter lens. So that's the one where you have to press the button and zoom in and out. I do not want you to use this one for your portraiture project. The one that I want you to use for your portraiture project, let me grab it so I can show it to you all. So I would like for you all to use the secondary lens that's in your bag. So it's a prime lens. You can't zoom in and out with it, but it's your 35 millimeter lens. So I'll put it up there so that you can see that a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you all can see it bigger. So this is the lens that you want to use. And right here, you all can see that it has that 1.8 aperture. So that means that you're going to be able to open your lens up. The opening will be much wider because when you're working with your 18 to 55, it's only going to open, I'll turn it this way so that you all can see, I see it's flipped, but it's only going to open to 3.5. So the difference between an aperture of 3.5 and 1.8 is actually really massive. And you all can get really beautiful blurry backgrounds and more shallow depth of field when you're using your prime lens, which is the 35 millimeter lens. When you photograph with this lens, open your aperture up to 2.8 or to f2 or to 1.8 and try taking photos with that. It's also going to allow you to have a faster shutter speed, which I would ask you why that's good. But when you're photographing a person, remember that they're breathing and they're nervous and they can move, and all of those things can affect the way that the photograph turns out. Lastly, when you're taking your pictures, when you turn your camera on, if you're taking a portrait of someone, so I'll take a picture in here right now. So if this was my picture, I would look at it and I would be like, okay, that's great. It's clear. You need to check and make sure that it actually is clear. So it should be a photograph of a person. You should be photographing, sort of focusing on the eyes or the nose. And then you need to click down here. There's sort of like a zoom button. So it's a magnifying glass with a plus. Actually zoom in and look at it and ask yourself, is it in focus? And if it is, great. And if it's not, then you've checked and you can try to change your shutter speed or open your aperture up a bit more to get a better photo. So you all have 10 photographs due. You need to have 10 different sitters. You can have one photograph that's a group portrait. You can have 1 or 2 photographs that are the details where it's like hands or knees. And then I will let you have 1 pet photograph. Everyone wants to take pictures of their pet, but it needs to be an outstanding photo. It shouldn't just be of your dog running in the yard. Try to get a really good portrait. And sometimes that can be tricky because they're an animal and they're going to be moving a lot. So otherwise you need a different picture of a different person for each portrait. So just know that that's what you're going to have to be working on. We have the studio space that is, if behind my whiteboard wasn't a wall, the studio space is on the other side. So Miss Quiroga will have the keys for that. You can go in there and she can just sort of show you how to use it. We've got different color backgrounds that you can set up. And then we have 2 lights. when you photograph in there, you should turn off the overhead lights because you don't want them sort of counteracting with the lights that we have. And those lights are super easy. You can push them really close to the person you're photographing, and sort of shoot through them so that we can't see the lights on the sides, that they're just illuminating the person. And I'm sure that she can help you with that too. So that is that. So I hope you enjoy this lesson.